The wind, a relentless sculptor of ice and snow, howled across the barren expanse of Silver Bluff, its mournful cry echoing the desolation that clung to the land. A lone figure, small and insignificant against the vastness of the winter landscape, emerged from the swirling snow. She was a woman cloaked in a worn brown shawl, its frayed edges whispering tales of a long and arduous journey. Her face, partially hidden by the shawl, was pale and drawn. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sea, held a haunted look. She carried nothing but the weight of her unspoken past, a burden that bowed her shoulders and slowed her steps. Her name, once a song on her lips, was now a ghost, a whisper she dared not utter. She was a shadow, adrift in a sea of white, seeking refuge in a place whispered to be a sanctuary for the lost. Silver Bluff. The name itself held a certain desolate beauty, a promise of quiet oblivion. She had heard whispers of it in hushed tones, a place where the world's sharp edges softened, where the past could be laid to rest, buried beneath the deep snows. It was a desperate hope, a fragile thread she clung to, as the icy wind gnawed at her exposed skin. Through the swirling snow, a faint glimmer caught her eye. A single light, flickering like a fragile ember, in the vast expanse of white, beckoned her forward. It emanated from a small cabin nestled amongst the towering pines, a fragile haven against the brutal elements. Smoke curled from its chimney, a wisp of grey against the stark white, carrying the promise of warmth and shelter. This was where Weston Grady lived, a recluse haunted by ghosts of his own, a man who had known loss so profound it had hollowed him out, leaving only a shell of the man he once was. The woman, her body numb with cold, her spirit weary from the weight of her unspoken past, approached the cabin with hesitant steps. Each footfall crunched in the snow, the sound amplified in the vast stillness. She raised a trembling hand and knocked the sound, swallowed by the wind. She knocked again, harder this time, a desperate plea for sanctuary. The door creaked open, revealing a man silhouetted against the warm glow of the cabin's interior. Weston Grady, his face etched with the deep lines of grief, was framed by dark, unkempt hair streaked with grey. His eyes, the color of a winter sky just before dawn, held a weariness that mirrored her own. He looked at her, not with suspicion or judgment, but with a quiet understanding, a recognition of a shared desolation. He saw not a stranger, but a fellow traveler on the lonely road of loss. Without a word, he stepped aside, inviting her in. The cabin was small, a single room dominated by a large stone fireplace, where a fire roared, battling back the encroaching cold. The air was thick with the scent of pine and wood smoke, a comforting aroma that hinted at safety and warmth. A rough-hewn table sat in the center of the room, surrounded by 3 simple wooden stools. A small bed tucked into a corner offered the only other furniture. The walls, lined with shelves filled with well-worn books, spoke of a life once lived, a mind once engaged with the world. A faded photograph, its edges curled and brown, rested on the mantelpiece. It depicted a smiling family, a man, a woman, and 2 young children, their faces radiant with happiness. It was a stark contrast to the present, a painful reminder of what Weston had lost. The woman, her body shivering uncontrollably gratefully, stepped into the warmth. She closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the feeling of heat seeping into her frozen limbs. When she opened them, Weston was offering her a steaming mug, the ceramic warm against her chilled hands. The tea, fragrant with herbs and a hint of honey, warmed her from the inside out. She sat on one of the stools, her gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. Her silence, a heavy cloak, Weston, accustomed to solitude, moved about the cabin with a quiet efficiency, adding more wood to the fire, adjusting the kettle hanging over the flames. He did not press her for words. understanding the language of silence, the eloquence of unspoken pain. Days bled into weeks, the world outside the cabin, a swirling vortex of snow and wind. The two inhabitants of the small cabin existed in a shared silence, their interactions minimal yet profound. The woman who Weston silently referred to as Ilara in his mind, a name he'd chosen for its ethereal sound, reminiscent of the faint, distant starlight that sometimes pierced the perpetual gloom, helped with the daily chores. Her hands, calloused and strong, despite their delicate appearance, moved with a practiced efficiency as she chopped wood, carried water, and helped prepare simple meals. She moved with a quiet grace, a phantom flitting through the small space. Weston, in turn, provided her with shelter and sustenance. He taught her how to trap small game, how to identify edible plants beneath the snow, how to survive in the harsh wilderness. He shared his meager supplies, his knowledge, his silence. He found a strange solace in her presence, a quiet companionship that eased the gnawing loneliness that had become his constant companion. One evening, as the wind howled outside, rattling the windows of the cabin, Sarah noticed Weston staring at the faded photograph on the mantelpiece. His eyes were filled with a profound sadness, a grief so raw it seemed to emanate from him, like heat from the fire. Drawn by an unspoken empathy, Sarah rose and stood beside him. She didn't speak, but her presence was a silent offering of comfort. Weston turned to her, his eyes red-rimmed. "My family," he whispered, his voice hoarse. They were everything. He didn't elaborate, didn't need to. The photograph spoke volumes. The happy faces frozen in time were a stark reminder of what he had lost. The fire that had taken them had also consumed a part of him, leaving him hollowed out, a shell of the man he once was. Sarah reached out and gently touched his arm, a silent gesture of understanding. She didn't know the details of his loss, but she knew the language of grief. She carried her own burden of unspoken sorrow, a past she had tried to erase, a name she had discarded. In that shared moment of silence, a bond formed between them, a connection forged in the crucible of loss. The next day, as Sarah was helping Weston chop wood, she noticed a small, delicate wildflower pushing its way through the snow. It was a tiny splash of color in the otherwise monochromatic landscape, a fragile testament to the resilience of life. She picked the flower and brought it inside, placing it in a small, cracked vase she had found on one of the shelves. Weston noticed the flower, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. It was a small thing, a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. It was a reminder that even in the depths of winter, life persisted. Hope, fragile yet tenacious, could bloom even in the most desolate of landscapes. He looked at Sarah, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. He saw her not just as a lost soul seeking refuge, but as a survivor, a woman of quiet strength and resilience. He saw a glimmer of the person she once was, the person she could be again. Their shared silence, once a barrier, began to transform. It became a space of shared understanding, a language of unspoken comfort. They found solace in each other's presence, a quiet companionship that eased the gnawing loneliness that had become their constant companion. But the fragile peace they had established was precarious, threatened by the shadows of the past and the encroaching presence of the outside world. The sheriff's arrival was imminent, a storm cloud gathering on the horizon, threatening to shatter the delicate sanctuary they had built together. The premonition of Sheriff Burns' arrival settled over the cabin like a shroud, an invisible weight pressing down on Sarah and Weston. It wasn't a sound, not yet, but a shift in the atmosphere, a prickling at the edges of their fragile peace. The fire in the hearth, usually a comforting presence, now seemed to crackle with an anxious energy. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Sarah felt a knot tighten in her stomach. The The past which she had so carefully buried beneath layers of silence and anonymity stirred within her, a restless ghost threatening to break free. She glanced at Weston, his face drawn and tight, his eyes fixed on the frosted window pane. He saw the fear in her eyes mirrored by the apprehension in his own. The silence was shattered by the distant crunch of hooves breaking through the crust of snow. The sound grew steadily louder, closer until it stopped abruptly outside the cabin door. A heavy knock followed, echoing through the small space like a judge's gavel. Weston took a deep breath, steeling himself. He moved to the door, his hand resting on the latch, his body shielding Sarah from view. He opened the door, revealing Sheriff Eli Burns, a figure as imposing and unforgiving as the winter landscape itself. Sheriff Burns was a tall man, his broad shoulders filling the doorway. His face, weathered and lined, held an expression of grim determination. His eyes, the color of glacial ice, scanned the interior of the cabin, taking in the meager furnishings, the flickering fire, the woman huddled in the shadows. "Weston Grady," the sheriff said, his voice a low growl. "I received a report of a woman staying here. A woman with no name, no past." Weston met the sheriff's gaze, his expression unreadable. "She's under my protection, Sheriff." "Protection," Burns scoffed, stepping into the cabin, bringing with him a gust of frigid air and the scent of pine needles and horseflesh. "From what the law? This woman could be a criminal, a fugitive. I need to know who she is." Sarah, her fear warring with a newfound sense of defiance, stepped out of the shadows. She stood tall, her gaze meeting the sheriff's unflinchingly. "I have a name," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "It's Sarah." The sheriff's eyes narrowed, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Sarah, just Sarah. No last name, no history. I need more than a name. Woman, I need proof of who you are, where you come from, what you're running from." Sarah flinched at his words, her carefully constructed wall of silence threatening to crumble. Images flashed through her mind: a suffocating marriage, a desperate escape, a life lived in the shadows. The past, like a pack of hungry wolves, clawed at the edges of her memory, threatening to tear her apart. She closed her eyes, fighting for control. When she opened them, her gaze was steady, her voice firm. "My past is my own," she said, her words echoing in the small cabin. "I came here to escape it, to start anew. This is my home now." The sheriff turned to Weston, his expression skeptical. "You vouch for her? Grady, you know nothing about her." Weston looked at Sarah, a silent understanding passing between them. He saw the fear in her eyes, but also the strength, the unwavering determination to protect her fragile new life. He made a choice that would irrevocably change both their destinies. "She's Sarah," he said, his voice unwavering, "and she's welcome here." The sheriff, frustrated by their defiance, paced the small cabin, the floorboards creaking beneath his heavy boots. He knew he couldn't legally force her to leave, not without a warrant, not without concrete evidence of a crime. But he wasn't ready to give up. He had a feeling about this woman, a sense that she was hiding something. "All right, Grady," he said, his voice laced with a thinly veiled threat. "But if anything happens, anything at all, I'll be holding you responsible." He turned and left the slamming of the cabin door, echoing the storm brewing within Sarah's heart. With the sheriff gone, the tension in the cabin slowly dissipated, replaced by a palpable sense of relief. Sarah looked at Weston, her eyes filled with gratitude. He had chosen to believe her, to protect her, even though he knew nothing about her. His act of faith had given her something precious, something she hadn't felt in a long time. "Hope. Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Weston nodded, a rare smile touching his lips. The shared danger had forged a bond between them stronger than words, stronger than the secrets that still lay buried between them. The sheriff's visit had forced a confrontation, a revelation not of Sarah's past, but of the strength they found in each other. The silence between them, once a barrier, was now a bridge, a testament to the unspoken trust that was slowly blossoming in the heart of the frozen wilderness. But the sheriff's parting words hung heavy in the air, a chilling reminder that their sanctuary was fragile, their peace precarious. The past, like the relentless winter winds, threatened to return to unearth the secrets Sarah had so desperately tried to bury. Later that evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the cabin walls, Sarah found herself drawn to Weston's bookshelf. She ran her fingers along the spines, her eyes scanning the titles. She noticed a well-worn copy of Wuthering Heights, and a pang of memory, sharp and bittersweet, pierced through her carefully constructed wall of silence. She picked up the book, her fingers tracing the embossed title. "You Like Bronte." Weston's voice startled her. It was one of the few times he had spoken to her directly, and his voice, though quiet, held a certain warmth that resonated within her. She looked up, surprised. I used to," she whispered, her voice raspy from disuse. He nodded his gaze, holding hers for a moment, before he turned back to the task of mending a tear in his worn coat. "My wife. She loved Bronte," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The mention of his wife hung in the air, a tangible presence in the small cabin. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for this man, this stranger who had opened his home, his solitude to her. She wanted to ask him about his wife, about his loss, but the words caught in her throat, the memories still too raw, too painful, held her captive. She sounds like a wonderful woman." Sarah finally managed, her voice barely audible. A flicker of sadness crossed Weston's face. He reached out and took the book from her hands, his fingers lingering on hers for a moment. "She was," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He opened the book, revealing a pressed wildflower, its delicate petals faded, but still holding a hint of color. "She found this the day before." His voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The shared silence that followed was filled with unspoken understanding, a recognition of the deep, abiding pain they both carried. In that moment, the walls between them began to crumble, replaced by a fragile bridge of shared humanity. The sheriff's intrusion, though threatening, had inadvertently brought them closer, solidifying their bond and strengthening their resolve to protect their newfound sanctuary. But the past, like a persistent shadow, still lingered, waiting for its moment to emerge from the darkness. The days following Sheriff Burns' visit settled into a quiet rhythm, a fragile peace descending upon the cabin. The threat of the sheriff's return, though ever present, gradually receded into the background, replaced by a growing sense of security and belonging. The shared experience had forged a bond between Sarah and Weston, a silent understanding that transcended words. The long winter days, once a symbol of Sarah's isolation and fear, began to take on a new meaning. The stark beauty of the snow-covered landscape, the silence broken only by the wind whispering through the pines, the warmth of the fire in the hearth. These became sources of solace, reminders of the sanctuary she had found in Silver Bluff. She began to emerge from the shadows of her past, tentatively at first, like a delicate wildflower pushing its way through the frozen ground. She found a sense of purpose in the daily routines of the cabin, chopping wood, tending the fire, preparing meals. Her hands, once clenched with fear, now moved with a newfound confidence. A quiet strength. Weston, too, began to change. The deep lines of grief that had etched his face began to soften, replaced by a flicker of hope, a rekindled spark in his eyes. Sarah's presence, her quiet resilience, had chipped away at the wall of grief he had built around himself, allowing a sliver of light to penetrate the darkness. He began to share stories of his past, hesitant at first, then, with increasing openness, as if sharing the burden eased its weight. He spoke of his wife, Mary, her infectious laughter, her love of books, her gentle spirit. He spoke of his children, their boundless energy, their infectious curiosity, their bright futures that had been cruelly extinguished. Sarah listened patiently, offering silent comfort, her presence a balm to his wounded soul. She didn't offer platitudes or empty promises, understanding that true healing came not from words, but from shared silence, from the simple act of being present. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the snow-covered landscape, Sarah found herself drawn to the small patch of cleared land behind the cabin. She had noticed a few early spring wildflowers pushing their way through the melting snow, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the muted tones of winter. An idea took root in her mind, a desire to cultivate a garden, a symbol of her own rebirth. She shared her idea with Weston, her voice filled with a tentative enthusiasm. He listened intently, his eyes reflecting her newfound hope. He agreed to help, a rare smile gracing his lips. Together they began to clear the land. Their movements synchronized their shared purpose, a silent testament to the bond that had grown between them as the days grew longer and the snow began to melt. Revealing the rich earth beneath, Sarah's garden began to take shape. She planted seeds, carefully nurturing the fragile seedlings, watching with a quiet joy as they grew, reaching towards the sunlight. The garden became her sanctuary, a place where she could connect with the earth, with the rhythm of life, with the hope of a new beginning. Weston, watching Sarah tend her garden, felt a stirring within him, a sense of renewal he hadn't felt since the fire. He began to repair the neglected areas of the cabin, replacing broken windows, patching holes in the roof, rebuilding the small porch that had collapsed under the weight of the winter snow. He found solace in the physical labor, a sense of purpose in creating something new, in rebuilding his life. Piece by piece. One evening, as they sat by the fire, sharing a simple meal of roasted rabbit and wild greens, Sarah spoke, her voice hesitant. I remember something, she said, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. A name. Elizabeth, I think. I think it was my daughter's name. Weston looked at her, his eyes filled with compassion. He reached across the table and gently took her hand. Tell me about her, he whispered. And so Sarah began to speak, her voice trembling at first, then growing stronger as she delved into the memories she had so long suppressed. She spoke of Elizabeth, her bright eyes, her infectious laughter, her love of dancing in the rain. She spoke of her husband, John, his controlling nature, his escalating anger, his violent outbursts. She spoke of the night she escaped the terror of running, the heartbreak of leaving her daughter behind. As she spoke, the dam that had held back her memories finally broke. The tears flowed freely, cleansing her of the pain she had carried for so long. Weston listened patiently, offering silent support, his presence a beacon in the darkness of her past. The act of sharing her story, of speaking her daughter's name aloud, was a turning point for Sarah. It was a release, a catharsis, a reclaiming of her past. It was the beginning of her healing, the first step on the long road to forgiveness and self-acceptance. The arrival of spring brought with it a renewed sense of hope. The wildflowers in Sarah's garden bloomed in vibrant hues, a testament to the resilience of life. The trees began to bud their branches, reaching towards the sky, a symbol of renewal and rebirth. The world outside the cabin, once a source of fear and isolation, now beckoned with the promise of new beginnings. But the past, though buried, was not forgotten. The sheriff's threat still lingered, a dark cloud on the horizon, and the question of Elizabeth, of what had become of her daughter, remained unanswered, a constant ache in Sarah's heart. The journey to healing was far from over. But in the shared silence of the cabin, in the warmth of the spring sunshine, Sarah and Weston found strength in each other, a shared hope for a brighter future. Spring unfolded in Silver Bluff, painting the once stark landscape with vibrant hues of green and gold. Sarah's garden flourished a riot of color against the backdrop of the thawing wilderness. It was a testament to her resilience, a symbol of the new life she was cultivating within herself. Weston, too, found a renewed sense of purpose, his days filled with rebuilding and repairing, not just the cabin, but also the fractured pieces of his own life. The shared silence between them, once a refuge from the world, now held a new depth, a comfortable intimacy, born of shared experience and mutual understanding. They spoke more, now sharing stories, dreams, and the fragile hopes they held for the future. Sarah, emboldened by Weston's unwavering support, began to speak more openly about her past. The details emerging slowly, painfully like shards of glass from a deep wound. She spoke of her marriage to John, a man initially charming and attentive, who gradually revealed a darker, more controlling side. She spoke of the emotional manipulation, the subtle isolation, the escalating anger that culminated in physical violence. She spoke of Elizabeth, her bright-spirited daughter, caught in the crossfire of their toxic relationship. The fear for her daughter's safety had been the catalyst for her escape, a desperate act of self-preservation that had left her haunted by guilt and uncertainty. Weston listened patiently, his heart aching for the pain she had endured. He shared his own story of loss, the devastating fire that had claimed his family, the agonizing grief that had consumed him. Their shared vulnerability created a deeper connection between them, a bond forged in the crucible of suffering. One sunny afternoon, as Sarah was tending her garden, a figure emerged from the trees, his silhouette dark against the bright sky. It was Sheriff Burns. Sarah's heart sank. The past, which she had tried so hard to outrun, had finally caught up with her. Weston, sensing her fear, stepped out of the cabin and stood beside her. He faced the sheriff, his stance protective, his expression resolute. "Sheriff," Weston said, his voice calm but firm, "what brings you back to Silver Bluff?" The sheriff's gaze shifted from Weston to Sarah. His eyes narrowed. "I've been making inquiries," he said, his voice gruff. "I know who you are. Sarah, your real name is Catherine Livingston, and you're wanted for questioning in connection with the disappearance of your daughter, Elizabeth." Sarah felt a wave of dizziness wash over her, the world tilting precariously. Her carefully constructed facade crumbled, the fear she had so long suppressed rising to the surface. It's not what it seems," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The sheriff stepped closer, his expression unwavering. "We'll see about that, Mom," he said, his hand reaching for the handcuffs at his belt. Weston stepped forward, placing himself between Sarah and the sheriff. "She hasn't done anything wrong," he said, his voice rising in anger. "She's a victim, not a criminal." The sheriff hesitated, his gaze fixed on Weston. He saw the fierce protectiveness in his eyes, the unwavering determination to defend the woman beside him. He also saw the deep lines of grief, the lingering shadows of his own loss. He sighed, a flicker of understanding, softening his harsh features. "I have a duty to investigate Grady," he said, his voice softening slightly. "But I'm willing to listen to her side of the story." And so Sarah, with Weston at her side, recounted the events that had led to her escape, the fear for her daughter's safety, the desperate measures she had taken to protect herself. She spoke of John's controlling nature, his violent outbursts, his threats to take Elizabeth away from her. She spoke of the night she fled, the agonizing decision to leave her daughter behind, the hope that she would be safer without her. The sheriff listened intently, his expression thoughtful. He asked questions, probing for details, searching for inconsistencies. He contacted his office, requesting information on John Livingston, Sarah's husband. The information he received confirmed Sarah's story. John Livingston had a history of domestic violence, and there were several outstanding warrants for his arrest. He had been seen leaving town shortly after Sarah's disappearance, taking Elizabeth with him. The sheriff turned to Sarah, his expression softened with compassion. "I believe you, Catherine," he said. "You're not a fugitive. You're a victim, and I'm going to help you find your daughter." The relief that washed over Sarah was overwhelming. She wept openly. Tears of grief and joy mingled together. Weston held her close, his presence a silent promise of support and strength. The sheriff, with Sarah's help, launched a nationwide search for John Livingston and Elizabeth. Weeks turned into months, the waiting agonizing, the uncertainty a constant weight on Sarah's heart. Finally, after months of searching, the sheriff received a call. John Livingston had been apprehended in a small town in California. Elizabeth was with him, safe and unharmed. The reunion between mother and daughter was emotional, a moment of profound joy and healing. Elizabeth, though understandably confused and scared, clung to her mother, her small arms wrapped tightly around her neck. Sarah, with Elizabeth at her side, returned to Silver Bluff, her heart filled with gratitude. The cabin, once a refuge from the world, had become her true home, a place of healing and rebirth. Weston, her steadfast companion through her darkest hours, greeted them with open arms, his eyes filled with a quiet happiness. The past, though still a part of them, no longer held the same power. They had faced their demons, confronted their fears, and emerged stronger, more resilient than ever before. The spring had given way to summer, the wildflowers in Sarah's garden blooming in vibrant profusion, a symbol of hope and renewal. The future, once a bleak and uncertain landscape, now stretched before them, filled with the promise of love, family, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. They had found solace in the wilderness, healing in each other's presence, and hope in the promise of a new beginning. The whisper of Silver Bluff, once a mournful dirge, now carried a melody of hope, a testament to the transformative power of love, resilience, and the enduring strength of the human spirit.